So we had dropped Puka Nacua in our rankings last week after the injury, but honestly, now that we are a week through it and you have the week 8 bye for Puka that he was going to miss regardless, I actually think there's a real shot that he's back in week 9. So we will have Puka Nacua right back to where he was as the wide receiver 1. I'm going to keep him in the same tier as these other names. If y'all remember back before he was injured, he was in his own tier. But now I think that you can have him alongside Jackson Smith-Njigba, who will be next. JSN has been incredible. JSN is averaging 116 receiving yards per game. He's had 27 fantasy points and 30 fantasy points in back-to-back contests. Now, I am recording this before the Monday night game, so I'm not going to be able to let you know exactly what JSN does against the Houston Texans. I can just go ahead and pull it up on Underdog Fantasy and give you a sense of what the projections say that he may or may not do. But he is currently higher lower 87.5 receiving yards and higher lower 16.45 fantasy points, which was the highest projection of any wide receiver this week, including CeeDee Lamb. CeeDee Lamb comes out, immediately gives you the big receiving touchdown his first game back in here for the Dallas Cowboys. But realistically, you didn't have to have a ton of passing volume for Dak. You had multiple receiving touchdowns going in the direction of Jake Ferguson. But clearly with the Jaden Daniels injury, it was a tough spot for the Commanders with Marcus Mariota to keep up, to make the Dallas Cowboys keep the pedal to the metal. But CeeDee Lamb going to be in a super good spot rest of season, clearly fully healthy. And then with Ja'Marr Chase, I understand a lot of people are going to be upset with us having him this low because right now, he is coming off a game where he had 38.1 points. He had 23 targets, 16 receptions, 161 receiving yards. And against the Pittsburgh Steelers, Joe Flacco was just spamming Jamar slants over and over and over and over again. But realistically, I do think that we have to at least acknowledge the fact that Ja'Marr Chase definitely has the worst quarterback in this tier by far. So even if I think he's the most talented wide receiver in this tier, I'm going to put a discount on him. Now, moving over to our next tier, we're going to be led off with Amon-Ra St. Brown. And honestly, St. Brown should probably be an S tier wide receiver. If you look at the projections for him tonight, he is higher lower 75 in receiving yards, higher lower 15.45 fantasy points. We'll see what he does tonight. And obviously, I'll be live streaming after the game tonight, updating these rankings for you then. So just make sure you are subscribed. And also, we're about 1,000 subscribers away from hitting 300K. So if for whatever reason you're not subscribed, help us out. Come on. Justin Jefferson will be our next name with Jettas. He had 10 targets this past week. 3 games straight now where you've had Carson Wentz. I'm kind of force feeding Justin Jefferson where he's had 10 targets in every contest. He's actually only had 1 receiving touchdown so far this season off of 52 targets for a touchdown rate less than 2%. Realistically, you should expect some positive regression with this soon. Going over and looking at Rashee Rice. Rice is coming off a game in which he had multiple receiving touchdowns for the Chiefs. Obviously, he's a red zone weapon. You only had 42 receiving yards. We know Rice isn't like the biggest play wide receiver, but again, with the Kansas City Chiefs, you are going to have consistent trips to the red zone, and you are going to have Rashee Rice heavily involved once he gets to that area of the field. Drake London, you have a really striking difference between the games in which Darnell Mooney plays and the games in which Darnell Mooney misses. Like, you would think that it wouldn't make that big of a difference. And because it's a small sample size thing, I'm going to assume that it's more of a coincidence than anything. But a lot of those blow-ups that you have from Drake London where he scores 25, 30 fantasy points, you are getting that mainly when Mooney has been out. And then with Nico Collins, he's been very disappointing so far this season. He's actually only averaging 14 fantasy points per game, but he's already through the bye. He's currently a higher lower 73.5 receiving yards on Underdog. But what's interesting is I guess he's just very unlikely to score a touchdown because they have him only at higher lower 11.95 fantasy points, which obviously you can say that the Texans offense is much worse than what you have with some of these like the Detroit Lions and the Kansas City Chiefs. Now moving over to B tier, I cannot tell you how pissed it made me to watch Davante Adams score 3 touchdowns to allow Badaki, the 0-6 team in my league, beat me and stop me from becoming the #1 team in the league yet again. Unbelievable. I had the worst Sunday that I've had all season. I was so pissed. 35 receiving yards, but 3 receiving touchdowns. Red zone monster. I want to give him the benefit of the doubt in the rankings, averaging almost 16 points per game when Puka is injured. Now, once Puka is officially fully back and healthy, then at that point, I think Puka probably goes back to being in his own tier in these rankings, and Adams as well slides down B tier. Now, Igbokwe will be our next name. It seems like he actually has a very real chance of playing tonight, which is extremely weird because my expectations once he had the hamstring injury against the Niners would be that he was missing the next 2 weeks against the Lions and the Saints based off initial reports. But for him to apparently be this close to returning this week, I mean, I think at the very worst case scenario, you're getting him back in week 8, but you're also having Mike Evans return as well. George Pickens will be our next name. Dak Prescott is looking like he's going to lead the NFL in passing yards and passing touchdowns. So if that happens, there's a very real possibility that CeeDee Lamb and George Pickens are this year's version of Jamar Chase and T. Higgins from last year. Rome Odunze has his second game where he has slid him back down to earth in a dramatic way. I don't want to overreact though, because realistically he's still averaging 15 points per game. And again, you go back 2 weeks ago against Washington, he did have that receiving touchdown called back where if that stood, then Rome would actually be even higher. But yeah, there aren't many players ranked behind Rome that have averaged more points per game than him so far this season. And then he's also through the bye, so you get him for an extra week and you still have the tiny percent chance that DJ Moore gets dealt. Courtland Sutton is either going to give you 15 or more points or he's going to give you 3 or fewer. There's nothing in between. You'll never get a 4 reception, 40 receiving yard game for Courtland Sutton. It's either going to be 6 receptions, 87 receiving yards, or 1 reception for 17. It's the weirdest thing ever. But I mean, honestly, if we just look at our weekly rankings next week, Sutton may be a top 8 wide receiver for us because he gets to go up against the Dallas Cowboys. And then A.J. Brown gives you the massive blow up where he has multiple receiving touchdowns, 121 receiving yards in this game against the Minnesota Vikings. And very clearly, if the Philadelphia Eagles are going to have to throw the ball, A.J. Brown's and Devonta Smith will be great. We'll talk about Smith in just 1 second. But if they are not going to have to throw the ball, then it's going to be a spot where they have a really low floor. Now, I'm going to be 100% honest with you. Please understand that when we are making a rankings list, it is extremely difficult to show the true value gaps that you have between some of these names. Like the value gap that you have between, say, like Rashee Rice to Nico Collins, that gap from 7 to 9, or let's go Rashee Rice to Davante Adams, right? That gap from 7 to 10 is a larger gap for me than wide receiver 16 to 28 in our rankings. These next 12 wide receivers are all about the same. They're all players for me that when they're healthy, you got to put in your starting lineup. If we were predicting points per game going into the future, they're all going to be within about a point per game, at least in my projections. So even though Chris Olave is wide receiver 16, when we look at Keenan Allen, who's wide receiver 27 in just a second, understand they are very, very close together. With Olave, you had some trade rumors. I think that they're still very much valid just because this Saints team isn't playing for anything. You get the big spike week this past week showing that he does have the upside and the efficiency is actually trending in the right direction. We've seen now for back-to-back weeks where his yards per target and his yards per route run have actually swung. And what's really interesting is you've actually had decent projections for the New Orleans Saints with Spencer Rattler under center over the past 2 weeks as well. Mike Evans will be our next name. With Evans, you can pretty much be guaranteed that this team wants to try to get him to 1,000 receiving yards. If Baker can, he will force feed the ball in that direction. Realistically, I still think that Igbokwe has shown enough where he's probably the wide receiver 1 for this team in the long term. But Evans still going to be very capable. The concern I would have is Godwin possibly coming back after the bye. I'm not the biggest Zay Flowers guy. I know Zay Flowers looked really bad over the past few weeks, but it was frankly because you have no Lamar Jackson, so the offense was garbage. Coming out of the bye week, I'm expecting Lamar to be good to go. Flowers will be much better. Tetairoa McMillan only averaging 11.9 fantasy points per game, but every single game this year, he's had at least 5 targets. I understand that Bryce Young's horrible. Y'all know I'm not a Bryce Young fan, but I do expect the rookie wide receiver to continue to get better as time goes on. Garrett Wilson, from a points per game perspective, would actually be higher than this in our ranks. I'm going to assume you don't get Garrett Wilson back until week 10 at the very earliest, knowing that the Jets have the week 9 bye. But also, this Jets team's not playing for anything. So if I was Garrett Wilson, I'd be fine just rehabbing and collecting paychecks, to be honest. But that's just me. I'm not a warrior athlete like Garrett Wilson is. And then with Deebo Samuel, God knows what this injury is going to be like. He didn't practice all week leading up to the Dallas game. I mean, he didn't practice all week, but he still played against the Chicago Bears 2 weeks back, and he clearly looked injured where he only had 15 receiving yards in that game. So it will just be very important to monitor what we have with the injury updates with Wilson and Deebo, and I'll make sure that we keep you updated every single day going in the future. Now, DK Metcalf is my wide receiver 1 on my team. And you're going to think, Mason, the wide receiver 1 on your team is the wide receiver 22 in your ranks? Yes, that's how down bad I currently am. Like I said, I've now fallen to 5-2, and I just lost against the worst team in my league. DK Metcalf is averaging about 14.5 points per game, but he's actually only at 6 targets per game. If you look at every wide receiver that we have put in these rankings so far, I mean, I'll just give you a little sneak peek as well. Every wide receiver that is wide receiver 31 or better in these rankings is actually averaging more targets per game than DK Metcalf. Metcalf's just been running hot with touchdowns, so I am worried that they're going to fall back down. Ladd McConkey, Quentin Johnston will be our next 2 names. Ladd's actually only averaging 12.5 points per game, like Quentin Johnston's up at 16.2. The Big Q very clearly has been the wide receiver 1 for the Los Angeles Chargers. I see no difference with how you value these players. I see no difference with how you value Michael Pittman and DK Metcalf. They're almost the exact same guy for me. Obviously, in games in which you have no Josh Downs, Pittman will be ranked dramatically ahead of DK Metcalf in my weekly rankings. But once you eventually get Josh Downs back in, I would be worried that the Pittman targets go back down to like 6 to 7 a game. Devonta Smith, crazy high ceiling, and thank God we got the 33-point performance. If y'all go ahead and look up my current underdog best ball team status, they are cruising, and Devonta Smith is helping with that in a big time way with this kind of spike week, but super inconsistent, right? You have, I mean, a total of 4 games with fewer than 10 fantasy points for Smith. So you're going to have these massive spikes, but you're going to have these massive duds as well, which is good in best ball, but in your regular league, it's going to be tough. Keenan Allen gives you a big spike this past week. Keenan Allen actually had been pretty bad for a 3-week stretch where he had 8.7, 10.8, 6.7 points leading into this, but now he explodes 429. He was the wide receiver 3 on the week. So like, I think you can be excited about Keenan. And then Jalen Waddle. I know that we just nuked this dude in our ranks. And again, like I said, realistically for me, the wide receiver 28 and the wide receiver 16, it's about the same thing. But dear God, please send Jalen Waddle anywhere but Miami. Now, going down to E tier, I am recording this before we have the update with the Brian Thomas injury. But with how bad Brian Thomas has been this season, where so far he's had 1 game this year with more than 12 fantasy points, and now he's injured, I would, like, if you're asking me at the time of this recording, before I get any injury updates with Brian Thomas, I would trade him for any wide receiver in C or D tier. Like, at this point, it looks like his rookie season, I don't want to say it was a fluke, but we're not getting back there. Looking at Jordan Addison, Addison comes through with a massive, massive game, almost 22 fantasy points. It's the first time this year that he does this with volume as well, 128 receiving yards. My concern again is I do think that Justin Jefferson here is eventually the long-term alpha, and I'm a little bit worried about what that means for Addison's target share. Travis Hunter will be our next name. Travis Hunter, you get the massive breakout game this past week. 14 targets, 8 receptions, 101 receiving yards, and the receiving touchdown. They don't really play him at all on the defensive side of the ball. They just pretty much allow him to be an offensive player. And if Brian Thomas is truly injured, you would assume that that actually continues going into the future. And then looking at what we have with Marvin Harrison, Marv, I mean, you thought like, oh, okay, he's actually able to play from the concussion. I guess he's viably. No, Marvin Harrison has 0 games this season with 20 or more fantasy points. Marvin Harrison in his career has played, I want to say, 24 games. And in those 24 games, he's had 2 games with 20 or more points. He really is just a name. T. Higgins, I have on my team. I also have Stephon Diggs on my team as well. So I would really like to go through and rank them higher than this, but I just think that they're such shaky projections every single week. Terry McLaurin, I have no idea what the injury update's going to be here. Xavier Worthy, looks banged up. Like, what's the upside with Worthy now? Back-to-back games with only 4 targets. I actually drafted Worthy in a lot of underdog best ball drafts, and a big mistake that I made, to be honest. And then Ricky Pearsall, we need to know the injury update with. I have no idea at this point. Now, going down to F tier, Wan'Dale Robinson may need to move up in these ranks. Again, if we were looking at sportsbook projections, they were actually very low on this offense for the New York Giants coming into this game. But what we need to now rethink about, and what we now need to have to reevaluate, is Wan'Dale Robinson under the assumption that Jackson Dart is an elite level quarterback. Elite's a poor choice of words. But Jackson Dart is going to give this offense above average quarterback play, and Wan'Dale Robinson has no target competition. Matthew Golden at the beginning of the game for the Packers, he looked like he was about to have a massive breakout, like on a single drive. I think he had 3 targets, 3 receptions. But then he falters out, ends up not doing much. And I mean, we're not that far off from Jayden Reed returning. Jameson Williams, massive boom bust wide receiver. You're going to get a lot of games with fewer than 5 fantasy points, but pick the right matchup and he'll go over 20 and some. Like right now, his median projection on underdog is higher, lower 8.5 points, but obviously the ceiling is crazy. Looking at Khalil Shakir, Shakir's yet scored 20 fantasy points in a game this season. Shakir's career high fantasy points is 21.6. And this dude's in his 4th NFL season. And obviously Josh Allen's been balling for a while. DJ Moore, not trustworthy whatsoever. I know he leads this team in receiving this past week, but still, his target volume's very consistent, but consistent in a bad way. 5, 6, 5, 5, 5, 5, not interested. Chris Godwin, I mean, the dude's so banged up, and now you have Mike Evans and Igbuka looking like they're going to be the wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2. I actually really like drafting Chris Godwin, thinking that we had a lot of late season upside in best ball drafts. That looks horrendous at this point. Jacoby Myers wasn't producing when he was healthy, and he's definitely not producing now. I mean, you haven't had a game with double-digit fantasy points since week 2. I think the hope is he ends up getting traded. And then going over and looking at Brandon Ayuk, this is the highest that we've had Brandon Ayuk in our rest of season rankings so far this year. But every week that goes by, he will be climbing higher and higher and higher until when he finally returns, he probably will be up there around like wide receiver 30, wide receiver 31 for us. And then he could continue to rise if he performs well. Romeo Doubs will be our next option. With Romeo Doubs, again, you do have to be somewhat concerned if you end up getting back Jayden Reed that the volume does go away, or that you end up getting just a breakout from the rookie and Matthew Golden. Jawan Jennings, super banged up. And also just this entire offense is one man and one man alone with McCaffrey. Keon Coleman doesn't look viable. Josh Downs, Trey Tucker, Jerry Jeudy, Kendrick Bourne, all these guys look like bums. Realistically, the big thing I want you to take away with this rankings list is wide receivers 16 through 28 are all the same. You're probably starting them if you play in a regular league, like a 12-team format, 2 wide receivers, 2 flexes. If you play in a super shallow format where you only start 2 wide receivers, 1 flex, and it's like a 10-team league, then I could see you benching one of those wide receivers 16 through 28. Wide receivers 15 and above are the must-start names. And then wide receivers 29 through 37 have the upside to turn into must-start players, but also have the downside where they just give you 4 points in any given week. And then the guys in tiers F and G, I'm probably not that excited to start, to be honest with you. But I think that's all I got for you. I really appreciate you. And of course, if you wanted to check out any of those projections like Jameson Williams, higher, lower, 8.5 fantasy points for tonight's game. Amon-Ra St. Brown, higher, lower, 15.45 fantasy points for tonight's game. I'll leave the link to Underdog Fantasy in the description as well as the comment section. If you use code FLOCK, you are going to be getting $100 added to your account after you play your first 5. And on top of that, you'll be getting a free Baker Mayfield pick, higher, lower, half a total yard. Plus, you'll be getting free questions that you can ask in the live streams. And we're live streaming every single day until Christmas, answering your fantasy football questions. Underdog is the #1 sports app in the App Store because it's an incredible app. It's available in almost every single state. And they have the best promos in the industry right now. But I really appreciate you. And I really hope I get to see you out in the live stream later tonight.